Hello and welcome to the 11th session of the Schoolyard Forest Design Lecture Series. And welcome back to this virtual community. Please update your names so we know who is here. You can find closed captioning in the Zoom toolbar. I encourage you to use the native land map link to learn more about the Indigenous history of the land you and your community inhabit, and share in the chat where you are calling in from today. My name is Lauren McKenna with Green Schoolyards America, and supporting me today are my colleagues Allison Torres and Michaela Randolph, and some other GSA staff. Today we will have a short intro from us, then our guest presentations, followed by brief Q&A time. This series is part of the National Schoolyard Forest System, whose goal is to increase tree canopy and shade students from extreme heat. We are all impacted by climate change in different ways. For some of you, you started the school year with some very hot days, and we hope this initiative has given you some tools and inspiration for big and small strategies to help keep students safe and comfortable. On the topic of helping students be safe and comfortable while also adding ecological value and richness to your campuses and engaging with students outside, here's a couple of resources that are a bit older for you to check out or revisit. In our National Outdoor Learning Library, please check out recommendations for allergies, noise, outdoor classroom culture and management in outdoor learning spaces. You can find many other resources in the National Outdoor Learning Library, as well as the Schoolyard Forest System Library. Some news. It has been a challenging week for many, but we want to share some good news for a change. Our staff, working closely with our partners, are celebrating a major win for schools in California. Senate Bill 1091 was signed into law by Governor Newsom this week. The bill was authored by Senator Carolyn Menjivar, co-sponsored by Green Schoolyards America and Trust for Public Land, and supported by many organizations and advocates. Just a brief overview. For freestanding shade structure projects, existing law caps the cost of complying with the accessible path of travel requirement to about 20% of that project's overall construction cost. Other projects might not have this cap. So some small projects, including greening projects, can become extremely cost prohibitive, sometimes preventing the projects from moving forward at all, in which case benefits no one. Basically, this legislation will help apply this same budget cap for schoolyard projects that improve community ecological health, climate resilience, and student well-being, learning, and play. It will significantly reduce barriers to help more California schools with limited resources implement schoolyard greening projects. The link in the chat has a little more info plus video testimony in support of the bill, including some from our own staff. Thank you so much to everyone who helped make this happen. Okay, so on to our guest speakers. They will share background information about schoolyard and air pollution concerns and risks, and introduce design features that can improve schoolyard air quality and those that may have an adverse effect. They'll focus on considerations and recommendations for planting trees and vegetation at schools to reduce air pollution and protect vulnerable students while creating vibrant, shaded, living green schoolyards, and share much more. We are lucky today to have Brent and Richard joining us. So to introduce them in full, Dr. Richard Baldauf has over 20 years of experience conducting research on emissions, air quality impacts, and adverse health effects from exposures to air pollution emitted by transportation and industrial sources. His research focuses on the development of policies and practices to mitigate air pollution, emissions, and impacts at local, urban, and global scales. His research has led to national emission standards and best practices, including methods to mitigate air pollution impacts using urban, built, and green infrastructure. He has a joint affiliation with the US EPA's Office of Research and Development and the Office of Air and Radiation, where he has led research teams focused on air quality measurements, air dispersion modeling, and sustainable urban development issues. He's an adjunct professor at the School of Engineering at North Carolina State and Texas A&M. He has published over 100 peer-reviewed journal articles and several book chapters on these topics during his time at the EPA. Brent Bucknum is a consultant on the Southwestern Medical District Project and brings over 20 years of expertise in ecosystem-based approaches to addressing environmental health and urban infrastructure challenges. He founded Hyphy Design Lab in 2008, an Oakland-based multidisciplinary engineering firm that partners with environmental justice communities nationwide. Hyphy develops green infrastructure solutions to mitigate the impacts of air, water, and soil pollution, as well as transportation and infrastructure challenges. The firm offers a comprehensive range of services, including consulting, software and hardware development, rigorous academic research, and active community engagement. Okay, so with that, welcome Richard and Brent. We will have a short time for Q&A after you both have presented. For folks joining us, please add your questions to the chat as they share. I will pass it off to Richard, who will get us started. Thank you both for being here.
Well, thanks for the introduction, Lauren, and we can go to the next slide. So for the presentation today, I'm just going to give a brief background, kind of an air quality 101 piece about, what are the sources of air pollution, what are some of the health concerns and why we want to mitigate these air pollution exposures and some of the air quality and climate mitigation options. But I'll spend a lot of time really talking about how we use urban green infrastructure as an air pollution mitigation strategy. What are some of the mechanisms, how vegetation works at reducing air pollution concentrations. I'll go through just a few examples of research on how vegetation affects local air quality, and it's really led into then the recommendations that we have for designs and applications of urban green infrastructure for, again, both air and climate pollution mitigation. And then I'll end talking a little bit too about co-benefits, cumulative impacts, cumulative benefits associated with urban green infrastructure. For this presentation, I'm really going to focus on impacts from highways and other transportation sources, mainly because there's so many schools, not just across the US, but even worldwide, that are located very close to these types of facilities. But just keeping in mind that a lot of the recommendations and the potential benefits of this urban vegetation at schools could be applicable when schools are located even near other air pollution sources, especially when those air pollution emissions are occurring close to the ground. So we can go to the next slide. And so again, focusing on transportation emissions, we have both passenger cars, we have the large heavy duty trucks, and when they combust either gasoline or diesel, both particles and gases are emitted. But also from transportation sources, we have brake, tire wear that also emit particles and even emit some gases. In addition, sometimes some of these pollutants from the vehicles themselves or even from other sources can be deposited onto the road surface and be re-entrained, especially, again, the particles. It could be even pieces of vehicles. It could be crustal material that's deposited from nearby land sources. So all kinds of things that could be re-entrained from the vehicle activity on the road as well. So we can go to the next slide. Often too, we're asked, what is the size of road that's of concern? And there's really no threshold or certain type or size of road, but we often look at some definitions of high volume roadways that either states or the U.S. Department of Transportation have, and they can give some guidelines on when to really start to be concerned about air pollution emissions and exposures. Generally, we look at about 50,000 vehicles a day. Then you really want to look seriously at these potential exposure concerns. But just again, keeping in mind there's no threshold. So, for example, if a roadway has a lower volume but has a large amount of big heavy duty trucks, then likely it could have some impacts even at lower volumes. But we really would again suggest if it's over 50,000, you really want to look at this very seriously. But then if it's under, you really want to take a look at what are the kinds of activities, what are the kind of vehicles that are happening on the roadway. If there's lots of idling, stop and go traffic, then even lower volumes may still be of concern. So we can go to the next slide.
Oh, all
Yep,
right, there we go.
There we go. All right, thanks so much. And again, with these air pollution emissions, it really leads to much higher concentrations near the road. So like this graph to the left just gives an indication. So these are just certain pollutants that are primarily emitted from traffic sources, from cars and trucks. And some of these pollutants can be as much as like 10 times higher within the first like 10, 20 meters compared to like 200 to 300 meters from the road. So generally we're concerned about impacts again within that, say 300 meter from the roadway distance. But again, as you can see from the graph to the left, it's a gradient from the road. So especially within say 100 meters, you can have concentrations again somewhere between 2-10 times higher near the road versus further away. And the picture to the right just kind of gives an indication. We're talking about within just this one just shows within 100 meters. So again, where you have very highly elevated potential for pollutant concentrations and exposures, it can still occur over 2-3 city blocks. But again, the impacts can go as far out as 3, sometimes even 500 meters, depending on meteorological conditions. We can go to the next slide. And again, there's been really over 1,000 studies of health effects for populations living, working, going to school near these large roadways and transportation facilities. This graph is from a meta-analysis done by the Health Effects Institute that was released in 2022. And you can see there's a whole host of adverse health effects that this meta-analysis showed, where again, people spending significant amounts of time near large roadways experienced increased adverse health risks. Again, it went from respiratory, cardiovascular, even premature mortality. And it's not just effect on adults, but they're seeing effects on children as well. And then it's also important to note, as shown in the bottom of this slide, this Health Effects Institute study didn't look at all adverse health effects that have been seen in health studies. There's been other reviews. For example, the CDC showed an association of near-road exposures with childhood leukemia. There's been multiple studies that have also shown effects on cognitive development and neurological disorders such as autism. So again, a whole host of adverse effects shown potentially around air pollution exposures near large roadways. So we can go to the next slide. And even though we're talking about a fairly small distance, there's still a really large number of people potentially exposed. So recently, EPA estimated there's over 72 million people that live within 200 meters of a large roadway or a transportation facility. So that also did include like airports and rail yards, although the vast majority were located near large highways and other motor vehicle transportation facilities. Another study done in 2017 estimated about 17,000 schools located within 250 meters of a heavily traveled road, and that represented over 4 million students. So again, a large number of children, a large number of schools also located within this distance where air pollution concentrations can be highly elevated. So we can go to the next slide. So because of these adverse health effects, because of these increased air pollution concentrations near roads, we're really concerned, and we want to look at how we can mitigate these exposures. And we're especially interested to know what we can do now. These are existing conditions, these are existing health concerns. So As EPA and even other organizations, we do look at things like, vehicle emission standards. There's over the history of time, have really led to big decreases in air pollution emissions, but they do take time to implement, and we need things like vehicle fleet turnover and the technology really even to be developed. There's also many programs looking at reducing, vehicle miles traveled, things like improving public transit, making walking, biking more accessible. But those also can take long to implement. There's a lot of like zoning and other kinds of permitting and investment involved in those. And then California, for example, has looked at development exclusion zones or buffer zones, and not allowing development within that near road distance, especially focused on schools. But there's many complications and difficulties in implementing that as well, and there have been some potential concerns about unintended consequences around there. So this is really one of the reasons that we've looked at green infrastructure like roadside vegetation and how that can be used to mitigate air pollution. And another reason that we really started looking at this is for the co-benefits as well. So it's not just around air quality, and I'll talk about that later in the presentation. So we can go to the next slide. So I'm going to just give a few brief examples of some of the work we've done, looking at how roadside vegetation affects local air quality. So this is one of our first studies that was done in North Carolina. And as you see in the picture to the top left, we have a limited access highway. And we have a clearing area and we have a vegetation area. And you can see the vegetation in the bottom picture. And so the graph at the right just shows particulate matter concentrations over time. And the solid line at the top is the measurements in the clearing, and then the dotted lines below are measurements behind the vegetation, and we measured it at two heights behind the vegetation as well, 3 and 7 meters above ground. And you can really see, especially in the morning, so the part of the graph to the left, in the morning, wind speeds were fairly consistent from the road. They tend to be a little lower. We tend to have calmer winds in the morning. And these are the conditions when, concentrations tend to be the highest. And we can see during this time, the big difference between the clearing and behind the vegetation. So we saw a big reduction behind vegetation in particulate matter concentrations. To the right of the graph, that's little later on in the afternoon, wind speeds started picking up, directions started changing. So you see overall concentrations went down. So we didn't see as much of an effect from the vegetation, but again, overall concentrations were lower, exposures were lower. So again, these are not the times of much concern for exposures. But again, when concentrations are high, exposure is high, we saw a big effect in reduction from the roadside vegetation. So we can go to the next slide. And so this slide shows results from a similar study done in the San Francisco Bay Area. So again, a limited access highway, and we had a clearing area, which is shown to the far left as site 1. And then we had a long stretch of roadside vegetation, but that vegetation had very different characteristics, along the stretch there. And so you can see the figures shown below to kind of give an idea. We had some parts where there was bushes, thick bushes, some with bushes and trees, heights varied a bit. But then we also had areas where we either had gaps where some vegetation had died, or we had some clearing areas where the vegetation had very high porosity. And so we were able to look at how characteristics of vegetation affected air quality. And you can see the results to the right. The very left is the on-road concentrations, but then again, stop 1 is the clearing area. And so then all the concentrations below that solid dark line, there are reductions in concentrations. If it's above that solid dark line, there actually saw increases. And so you see, for example, stop 6, which has the thickest vegetation, the tallest vegetation is a combination of bushes and trees. We saw reductions for certain particulate matter as much as 60% lower behind the vegetation compared to the clearing, but even some of the gases like NO2, CO, other types, black carbon, which is another type of particulate matter, saw reductions of 25%. But we can also then compare that to stop 3, which was very high porosity with some gaps. And there we either saw no reduction or very little reduction to even increases, especially in the gaseous pollutant concentrations. And so really what was happening is the air pollution from the roadway was funneling through that gap. But the fact there was some vegetation there causes the winds to slow down and stagnate. And so we can actually get a buildup of concentrations both within that area and behind that area. So this is, again, really highlighting the importance of vegetation characteristics. We can go to the next slide. And this is the last example I was going to show. Again, one of our first studies in North Carolina. And here we had, again, a limited stretch of limited access highway. We had a clearing area. We had an area that just had a solid noise barrier that was about 15 feet tall. And then we had a stretch with that solid noise barrier and vegetation as well. And so you can see from both the heat map at the bottom, but then also with the graph to the right, that again, in this case, the particulate matter concentrations were the highest in the clearing. We actually saw a reduction behind just the solid noise barrier. And then we saw even a further reduction with the solid noise barrier and the vegetation. So to the graph to the right, the very top line there is the clearing. That solid line in the middle with the filled in black boxes, that's the behind just the noise barrier. And then the very bottom line is the noise barrier and vegetation. So this is really starting to show us, again, the importance of vegetation. But again, there's been research also on solid noise barriers as well, showing that they do have some reduction. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. So we can go to the next slide. So based on this research, as well as other research that other groups, both again in the US and internationally, have done, we developed back in 2016 some recommendations. And in these recommendations, we really wanted to highlight, what are the characteristics needed that can lead to reductions in downwind air pollution concentrations. So be really essentially a mitigation method. But really, just as importantly, we wanted to highlight the characteristics that can cause increased downwind concentrations so we can avoid this kind of potential unintended consequence around roadside vegetation. And we can go to the next slide. And this one just kind of gives an idea first how vegetation, works and how it can be a mitigation option. So, as you see at the bottom right, we have the plume of emissions from vehicles on the road. And then there's essentially 2 ways that vegetation reduces downwind air pollution concentrations. So one, it does act as a barrier. So that's why we often call these vegetation barriers. And it causes the wind to lift up and have to go over the trees or the bushes. But then in addition to that, some of the air will pass through that vegetation, and things like particles and some gases can be absorbed into the leaf and branch surfaces and actually have some removal, especially of particulate matter, but again, some gases as well. And so the combination of these two can again lead to reductions in concentrations, behind that vegetation barrier by as much as 50–60%. So we can go to the next slide. And so in our guidance, we do have some examples of what we would consider effective vegetation barriers. And so those are shown in the pictures to the left. Some of the key characteristics is we want coverage from the ground to the top of the canopy. We want the vegetation sufficiently high. So again, it's at least above where the air pollution emission levels are occurring, especially considering like trucks. So we usually, again, are talking about somewhere like hopefully about 10 to 12 feet. But again, that can vary. We don't want any gaps. We usually recommend carnivorous or again, some type of the vegetation that doesn't have seasonal effects. So the vegetation barrier can be effective year round. And so this can be like pine trees as shown in the top two figures. We also can have some hedges that don't have seasonal effect as shown in the bottom picture as well. So we can go to the next slide. And again, just as importantly, we want to really highlight, what are the characteristics that do not, have any mitigation benefit and can actually cause increased pollution concentrations. So one of the ones I like to highlight often is the picture in the top left. A lot of times when we talk about roadside trees, people think of these nice ornamental canopy trees. They are really great for providing shading and cooling. But from an air quality perspective, again, they could lead to increased downwind concentrations. So as you can imagine, the plume off the highway, it wants to go underneath this canopy. That's the path of least resistance. So you get a buildup of concentrations there. But that canopy does also slow down the wind speeds again. So you get that stagnation effect and can get increased concentrations both within the canopy and behind the canopy. Again, you see some other examples, again, highly porous trees, bottom left. The middle bottom picture is just an area where, again, you can see there's some dead vegetation and some gaps there. So again, that same kind of effect. And then, we don't have as many like street canyon situations in the US, but if you do have a situation like this, there's been a lot of research showing that, street trees, again, they can slow down wind speeds in that street canyon, reduce ventilation, and again, cause some stagnation and buildup in air pollution concentrations. So we want to be really careful about, planting any kinds of trees in a street canyon situation like this. So we can go to the next slide. And as I mentioned with one of our research studies, the combination of the solid barrier and the vegetation itself and can actually have the greatest reductions in downwind air pollution. Both our studies have shown that, but others have also shown this as well. So these are just a couple examples. And so really essentially what happens is that solid barrier helps avoid any kinds of gaps or spacing underneath the trees. But then the trees have that added benefit of both increasing dispersion even more than just the solid barrier, but then also creating a surface for deposition and removal of certain air pollutant concentrations. So one other one I like to highlight in this graph, because sometimes when we talk especially about these vegetation barriers, both solid and vegetation, people are concerned about sighting from the highway. So I do want to highlight the picture at the bottom as well. And this is an example from Chicago, but this has been similar, have been installed in other locations. And so using like a plexiglass, a clear type of a barrier still could allow for visualization, but you can get that solid and vegetation barrier and still get some of that air pollution mitigation. So we can go to the next slide. So this again is just some conceptual ideas of either putting in vegetation alone or a combination of solid barrier and vegetation, especially in some cases where noise barriers already exist to further enhance their pollution mitigation opportunities. So we can go to the next slide. So again, just to kind of highlight some other considerations in addition to some of the examples that you've seen. So some of the important characteristics, again, height, thickness, length, and again, porosity. We can't have too porous vegetation, or you can actually have those unintended increased concentrations. As I mentioned, non-seasonal effects are very important. But also not mentioned, but a consideration are the species type. There are definitely certain species that increase pollution removal and retention, and others that don't do as effective a job. So really the leaf branch surfaces are really important. You want a lot of leaf area, things like hairy leaf surfaces or lots of ridges where pollution can be, or especially particles can be removed and retained, or things like with pine trees, you have the waxy needle surface. The pollution can actually be entrained within that waxy surface and retain there, so that we keep the pollution from going downwind. Then also, some vegetation can actually emit pollution or pollen, and so we always want to try to avoid that whenever possible. So again, species characteristics are important, but also consider whether things like native, non-native, how resistant it is to things like drought, flooding, road treatment. Again, when we're talking about near road trees as well. And then, of course, care and maintenance is important. As I said, if we have dying trees, if we have gaps, that can actually cause increased downwind pollution concentrations. So maintenance is very important. So we can go to the next slide. And kind of this last topic area I wanted to address is again, we look at this kind of from a cumulative benefits, not just from air quality. So there's so many co-benefits to adding the roadside trees. There's some increased CO2 sequestration, even soil, some methane can be removed. And again, as I mentioned, urban cooling can be important, stormwater runoff, flooding, water quality, noise, and just even aesthetics. And many studies have also just shown that people exposed to more green space, green areas have improved health. So again, all these co-benefits are important. So we can go to the next slide, and just quickly, this is just an example of how urban greening can reduce temperatures. So again, any kind of roadside vegetation can also enhance overall urban cooling. And then we can go to the next slide, and again, just a conceptual example of integrating both air quality and stormwater management with a green infrastructure project. So we can have the vegetation actually take out the particles from the air, keep them at the roadside, and then if we have proper like bioswales or other kinds of green infrastructure, stormwater mitigation, then we can actually do that treatment at the roadside as well. So we get those co-benefits. So we can go to the next slide. So last, I just wanted to mention, we do have some pilot studies. Our very first plantings were done in both a school at Oakland, California, as well as a park in Detroit, Michigan. So just those bottom pictures just kind of give you an idea before and after. And these are active studies. We took air quality measurements before the planting. We're taking air quality measurements after the planting as well, so we can see what kind of changes are resulting from these plantings. These are our first two. There's been other studies done both by ourselves and other groups. Louisville, there's a project going on in Dallas, and then there's been international work as well. There's been several projects in Europe too. So we can go to the next slide. And the very last thing I'll just mention in the presentation is that EPA did release in 2021 guidance. We did again focus on near road schools because there's so many of them, but this best practices is really applicable to, again, just about any school that is facing air pollution issues. And it goes through different mitigation options that schools can have if they're worried about air pollution exposures, both for indoor air as well as outdoor air, with outdoor air really, and again, focusing on this idea of both solid and vegetation barriers as well. So there's a link provided to that for any schools that might be interested. So we can go to the next slide. And again, I just want to acknowledge a lot of people, both within EPA and our external collaborators who have been involved with this research. So again, a lot of work and effort has gone into this. And then we can go to the next slide. And this is really just my contact information. I'm happy to answer any questions afterwards, but I know also we'll have a Q&A session after Brent's presentation. So look forward to speaking more about that. So thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Richard, for that incredibly rich and insightful background on roadside pollution and some vegetation solutions. I will go ahead and pass it off to Brent.
All right, I'm just gonna dive right in here, guys. It's great to be here. I am, first of all, a big Green Schoolyards fan. I've known Sharon for 10 plus years. I'm also a giant Rich Baldauf fan. It's one of my heroes who I've known for 10 plus years. So it's really exciting to be here. Hoping everyone can see my slides. What I'm going to do is give a little bit of background about sort of how we got into this work. And I think in doing that, I like to tell stories, but that will also hopefully show you sort of some of the critical things you need to look at in the design. And then I'm going to show you a case study from Louisville, Kentucky, where we did a vegetated buffer and then study its effect with a bunch of really cool partners. And then I'm going to show you sort of some tools and things we've been working on to help sort of different folks understand where vegetated buffers might be helpful, where schools might be near pollution. I saw a few comments asking about some of that, so hopefully I'll address that. And if not, Rich and I can afterwards. So just to give a little bit of background, we started our firm in 2009 in West Oakland, and I quickly met Miss Margaret Gordon, who's a very impressive environmental organizer. And very soon after that, a lot of our work became mission driven around targeting environmental justice. We run an urban planning, environmental engineering and design firm. And most of our work is actually targeted supporting environmental justice communities and those most impacted. Miss Margaret Gordon and I started a project called Adapt Oakland. And the vision was really to try to aggregate a lot of data that was being gathered from the air districts and the ports and really try to make that more understandable, both to community members and to urban planners, and also to try to come up with urban greening and urban planning solutions in general. So this framework we started probably around 2012, been working with her since 2008. One of the big things for us in our community, many other EJ communities have this, is we're surrounded by freeways and we're surrounded by a giant port. One of the things that our community sees often is like the smog coming out of these ships, which is like a very disturbing issue to see in your community. But one of the interesting things, and the reason we made this chart, is that from a climate change impact, that's really huge. You know, we've got tons of emissions coming from these ships. But from a human health standpoint, ironically, the trucks moving material in and out of these ports and delivering your products from Amazon now today are actually the biggest health concern. So even though it's a much smaller percentage of the overall pollution, because it's really close to people, that pollution causes most of the cancer and other health impacts. So this is comparison throughout a bunch of different counties in California here, but it shows a drop off similar to the maps that Rich was showing. The further you get away from the freeways, the less cancer health impacts there have been. And so we wanted to start visualizing this to people to really understand those impacts. So we built some tools for people to be able to understand and see where they were in proximity to those freeways. We then, in supporting West Oakland Environmental Indicators, they worked with EDF and what eventually became ACLIMA to sort of drive pollution sampling in the neighborhood, which essentially proved with more detail a lot of that same information. That there's this kind of concentration of pollution around the freeways, which is probably causing the most impact. EDF also collaborated, and EIP collaborated with researchers from Kaiser Permanente and found basically 3 blocks away from each other, 2 senior centers had dramatically different health impacts and heart disease impacts. The one closer to the freeway had much more impact. The one 3 or 4 blocks in the neighborhood had lower impact. So this was really startling information linked to health data. Really got us started to focus on how do we do more health research. Don't have time now, but we're actually working with EIP and the port and our transportation commission to develop a mitigation strategy right here in the neighborhood. So one of the things, more broadly for people that we're seeing is a lot of greening plans are being developed that are at this kind of census tract level, where they're saying there's more or less canopy. And I will get into some of the challenges of this that Rich was sort of alluding to. But one of the things we're seeing is also tons of prioritization right now around, for example, Justice 40 spending. Unfortunately, that data is also often at census tracts. The problem is that air pollution data, like water pollution, does not follow census tracts. And really what we found in working with Rich and many others is that like spatial scale and the resolution of what you're studying is critically important, especially with things like air pollution. And the reality is that near road conditions like buildings have a huge impact, in some cases beneficially, potentially buffering pollution from, let's say, a schoolyard behind it. But some cases, depending on the wind dynamics, it can actually trap pollution behind buildings. And getting into some of what Rich was saying, and one of the questions that came up is like, well, why is this an issue in those downtown urban environments? It's because where you have really dense buildings, they can impact wind dynamics, and you can kind of create these eddies, where in some cases you further concentrate the pollution there. So to show my actual Rich Baldauf fanboy history, I had reached out to Rich, realized it didn't actually get to him back in 2013, because we were doing this research and really excited because we wanted to look at like, not only can buildings, but can greening do some of this. And so we found these symposiums and this research that he started to put together, and we started publishing that. And then he said, I see you're publishing my research. Let's get together and collaborate. And so it was exciting because, as Rich was showing, he was doing a bunch of this work where he was measuring behind existing buffers, but he was also working with Max Zhang from Cornell to essentially research and model these conditions. And so this is a later study we did with Max and Khaled, who was a researcher with him. But what Rich was trying to talk about is this idea that like the shape of the vegetation, more on, you know, an individual species level, but also on a macro level, is really important to the dynamics of how the air moves. And so, for example, tons of haphazard trees that I call more lollipop trees or big, you know, shade trees, they can actually capture and trap pollution down below them. Whereas like dense hedgerows can actually deflect that pollution up above and ideally capture some of it. And so this model shows that in this case, having no trees could potentially be better than having randomly dispersed trees, whereas having a really dense, efficiently designed hedgerow could be significantly better than both. And so we saw as our role as like designers to try to help translate some of this complex science into simpler terms for community members and designers. Unfortunately, some people have learned this over the last decade. A lot of people are still out there planting shade trees everywhere, which is great, but it really is a matter of like, where are those important versus where are buffers important? Another little analogy that we've come up with is often people want to plant closer to the people, but sometimes actually getting the vegetation as close to the road as possible is actually more impactful. And May Visco in our office came up with a good analogy here that other people might be able to understand. So you can't see air pollution, but you can see and feel water. And so if you're walking next to a sprinkler, if you're really close to it, you're going to get hit by more water, and you're going to deflect probably more of that water than you are if you're way far away, where you're going to get less water and deflect less of it. So the idea is the more concentrated the pollution is, then the more possibility that you might be able to remove more of it or deflect more of it, as opposed to it dissipating. So these are some important things to show. Also, getting vegetation near roadways is critical. So moving on, I started working with a researcher named Rooney Bhatnagar at University of Louisville, and he was compelled by some of the work that was happening in Oakland and some health data he was figuring out. What we started to realize is we needed more health research, and we came up with this vision to basically do a clinical trial where we greened one neighborhood that was like our target neighborhood, and then we didn't green another neighborhood. We applied to the National Institute of Health, and what we wanted to do was study both environmental biomonitoring, so monitoring, you know, species and also the air quality, but then also human monitoring. So basically taking blood and urine and other health biometrics. At first, the NIH thought we were fairly crazy. Now, a decade later, we've published some of those results showing, you know, people living in this intervention zone, this was just published a month ago, are basically showing one indicator of heart disease and stroke and coronary artery diseases, these C-reactive proteins. They've shown 13% lower in this greener community, which is comparable to actually someone starting an exercise regime, which is really interesting. So we're just starting to get this data, but 10 years ago, that was not the case. And so we were really interested in where we could pilot this. And we knew that children, as well as, you know, for example, elderly and also, you know, women of birthing age or birthing mothers are some of the most at risk to what we call sensitive receptors. So we partnered with a school called St. Margaret Mary's, and we partnered with the University of Louisville. We partnered with the city of Louisville. We found a number of researchers from Cornell and WashU who I'll get into. And we've found a whole number of funders to fund this over a number of years. And the idea was that we wanted to target this school, and we found St. Margaret Mary's because it was basically right next to a busy road, and there was this big area where we could actually plant in front of the school, and we could kind of have space for a comparative control. So we could put a buffer in one side and have a control area on the other side. So some of the first things we needed to do was like design this planting. And for a lot of people doing greening, we need to think about buffers very differently. We need to have very dense packed trees like hedgerows. A lot of people are used to planting like 20, 30 foot on center. And in many cases, we're planting like much bigger trees than we would otherwise. These are like two big take home messages. The other interesting thing was, because this was a health study, we needed to kind of have a quick change. And as people know, trees grow slowly. So I'm going to show you a before and after, and this is less than 2 months basically from planting to fully planted. So this is before planting, and this is after planting. This is before planting, this is after planting. The way we did this was we actually used a technique in the trade that is more expensive, but it also gives you this sort of immediate impact where we spade trees in that are larger grown. So what we're able to do is dig out a hole and then drop a tree into it. And sometimes there's lower survival rates. We've found like if they get really babied, the survival rates can be really good. But what you're able to do is get this almost like instant gratification. And while this might be 3 or 4 times more expensive, in my mind, like children's health is worth that cost. And so I'm now advocating across the board, trying to really do dense established plantings where we can. So introduce you to Pradeep and Jay, who did a bunch of the environmental monitoring. Pradeep was a grad student in Jay Turner's lab, now works, I think, at the DOE and EPA, really phenomenal researcher. And these are some of the equipment. So on the left, we have passive samplers. Then we have an optical sensor to see how many cars are going by. Then there's air direction sensors, and then like a high resolution ultrafine sensor. And so the passive samplers are relatively affordable and can be then like distributed in front of the buffer and behind the buffer and then mailed in to get analysis. The ultrafine sensor is really expensive. And so what we did is we drove it around on an electric golf cart. So you can see these runs that go. The great thing about that is it's really precise. The challenge is that we're not able to have it out there all the time, like the passive samplers. So there's sort of benefits and pros and cons to different techniques. One of the really interesting findings from this study was just wind speed changes. And so basically, they found basically in general a 50% lower wind speed. And also that like the trees and vegetation tended to sort of concentrate and normalize the wind direction when it was changing a lot. Another interesting thing we found was the reduction in NOx, which is sort of an indicator of near road pollution, which can then sort of inform fine particulate matter potentially, but also is itself a health impact. So we were seeing on average between like 8 and 23% reductions depending on the season. And in the winter, for example, like those NOx levels are just higher, just there's like more emissions, but there's also a lot of environmental conditions that cause that to be higher, which is really interesting. In the ultrafine data, part of it, one of the challenges was we actually had, we're only able to sample at certain times. And in a place like Louisville, the wind speed and direction are changing a lot. And so when we averaged everything out, we were getting like about a 4 or 5% reduction. But when we actually aligned sort of or when the air pollution direction aligned with the buffer, we were getting up to 30% reduction, which is pretty incredible in my mind, from an ultrafine particle standpoint. One of the reasons that was also really interesting, that number, was basically we'd been working with Max Zhang, so I can share results with people, but we'd been working with Max Zhang, who worked with Rich also, and he'd been developing a bunch of different pollution modeling tools. And he'd been finding sort of between 25 and 50% removal, which is really interesting. So basically, we were starting to understand there was some potential alignment with those models. So we got additional funding with Jay and Max to sort of dig deeper into that. And one of the things in these models, one of the biggest drivers with vegetation is something called leaf area index. And so when the leaf area index is lower, the pollution drifts more. When it's higher, it gets stopped more. So most of us are then like, what does leaf area index mean, or leaf area density? So it's really sort of like the density of the vegetation looking at it from the side. So as Rich was saying, like at times, certain species or times a year, there's a much lower density. If you look at more evergreen species, they have more density throughout the year, but also all the way down to the ground. And so this is like the biggest variable as far as the airflow through the system. So we then developed a method basically for like measuring that using LiDAR, which is what's used for self-driving cars. And we developed a number of methods where we could then validate that data, where we basically combined it by measuring actual tree species. And, you know, May in our office and Fletch in our office developed a method where we dip them in wax to be able to measure before and after density. And through that, we've built a plant list now of species. And there's this huge range, basically, of what their leaf area density is based on species and cultivars and things like that. So over time, you know, knowing Sharon and what others would say is like, Brent, this is really exciting, but this is an insane amount of research and extremely expensive. And I would agree with her. So we actually in 2001 applied to the National Science Foundation to build some tools to basically try to streamline this, to make it easier for people to do in more places and to do in sort of more automated ways. So it doesn't have to be so bespoke for every project. So the kind of process is that you go from analysis using measurement and then doing design and coming up with solutions and then building interventions and then monitoring their impact. Another way to think of that is you can actually do models like we did for these projects to see what the change might be. And then you can plug in greening and other solutions. And then what you can do is model the potential benefit. Because green infrastructure is so expensive and road infrastructure is so expensive, modeling it helps you kind of optimize it. And then you can go plant it and measure it again. And so we've been building tools to be able to capture some of these things like leaf area density from easily available things like Google Street View. So we can kind of like get Google Street View data in the area and estimate those assumptions. We've also been building some tools to essentially, oh, it won't let me skip forward. I don't know where I'm on time, but I'm almost done. If we're okay on time, but basically,
yeah, a couple minutes is great, Brent.
yeah, we've been working on tools that allow us to help do this modeling a lot faster and more cost effectively and efficiently. So I will jump through, but these are allowing us to really look at the trees and the pollution dynamics. In this case, this is a project we're working on in Dallas in a corridor to see how the trees actually impact the pollution movement. So getting to the school finale here, why some of this can be useful. I was inspired in 2017 by this Jamie Hopkins article around school proximity roadways. I'm not sure if they got some of the 17,000 near road schools from Rich or vice versa. But what we found is like these types of tools are really important because we have schools coming to us all over saying like, do I need to be concerned about these pollution? And in some cases, you need to do more complex measurement or modeling, but in some cases, you can kind of use these metrics. So we've built this little tool so you can search schools. We've taken a lot of the data that they had and have started to advance it. One of the exciting things is we're still building out this data set. And part of the reason we're asking people here is like, we need to validate more of it. And we're interested in sharing this prototype with people, but we need to get more of the data at some sort of more of the schools. But one of the great things is that like, 60-70% of schools are not really necessarily near roadways and may not have nearly as much issues. But as someone was saying earlier, like maybe between 8 and 20,000 schools are very close to roadways. So we've been aggregating this data and that's relevant, and also newer pollution data that's coming out at the national level, and an increasingly important issue, which is called warehouse locations, where those are actually dramatically impacting air pollution in communities, and basically aggregating this data so you can see how impacted it is. So I'll just show you in LA where we're working with a community in Boyle Heights. They are in an area where there's significant amount of pollution. Here's a couple schools within the neighborhood we're working with, and some of those pollution models showing basically the whole community is really exposed because of these freeways. And that's also being seen at individual schools with really elevated particulate matter. So what we've been doing is building these tools so that you can go in and draw, potential vegetated buffers and then load them in and get sort of prioritized plant lists. So you can start to say like what species are going to be better for these buffers, what evergreen species are going to be better. And we're building out this database, to be and so that there'll be, species data for different zones. And these are just a few other ones that we've used this tool on in that same neighborhood. And this is a way to like help schools be able to do this work a lot more affordably than going through the complex process of doing all the research and then doing all the design. So yeah, that's it. I just wanted to share some of that with folks. We've got happy to connect with folks after and show them some of that and share some of that data.
Thank you so much, Brent. That was incredible amount of information and research. There's a lot of good questions. Yeah, if you can share a link to that program in the chat, that would be great. But we'll include links with the recording. Yeah, thank you, Richard. Thank you, Brent. We just have a couple minutes. Just to clarify that 17,000 schools near major US highways, is that number only public schools or is that a mix of all schools?
The study, at least that I was referencing, was focused on public schools. There might have been some in the database, but my understanding, at least, was it was focused on public.
Okay. So a lot of folks are asking about tree lists and specific tree species, including native plant communities as vegetative buffers. Is there anything you want to share a little bit about that?
Brent, do you want me to go first? I know
Sure, yeah,
I
you
bet you
go
have a
ahead.
lot of thoughts. So, but yeah, I would just say like we do definitely recommend native when possible, but I know there's a lot of complexities around that. We often point to the U.S. Forest Service iTree model because I know there were some questions about species and even spacing, and I know spacing is always a big issue. And I did see one comment about spacing, and I was going to mention that that was actually part of our Detroit project where we had some traditional spacing of 10, 12 foot or even more, like is often recommended. But we also did experimentations with spacing as much as like 4 or 5 feet only. And actually, the survivability has been the same, if not even a bit more, for the more dense packing spacing than it has been for the more widely spaced, again, in these tough, road conditions. And that was another issue though with species, and I didn't really mention it, but especially roadside, looking at like salt tolerance and other things like that. There's some species that can really handle it. And again, our survivability has been really well because our City of Detroit partners have really done a lot of work on that area. But again, it's just very important to work with folks like Brent and others, who really understand the species and what works best in these kind of given conditions.
Yeah, to follow up on that, what Rich was saying, I think a lot of arborists and urban forest folks have been really focused on sort of like survivability of trees and tree wells. And this is a really different approach to urban greening, and it sort of requires a different means of thinking. So we're trying to work with a lot of them to also look at like natural models, right? Like in nature, trees don't tend to grow 20, 40 foot on center. And there's actually this benefit of them like shading each other out, preserving moisture and water. And in some of these cases, we're sort of scaling them and saying like, well, when do we want it to be grown in? There's kind of an ideal balance. In some cases, we're actually like proposing, tree thinning at a time, right? Where it's like, let's plant denser now and let's look at more like succession planning in urban forests rather than this sort of urban street tree model where we like put a tree in the ground and think it's going to be there forever and know that it won't be. So it's really taking like a lot of different thinking about urban ecology and denser plantings. And so those are, yeah, in my mind, same thing. We've been really trying to gather species and work with arborists and tree nurseries and have gathered that for a lot of regions we're working in and have some of those databases.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of specific questions that folks have about the tool that you shared, Brent, but maybe we can maybe ask you a few more questions and share that with the recording. And I know people are curious about edible gardens and the impacts of air pollution on those. Someone also mentioned getting facilities maintenance buy-in on the concept in addition to safety and visibility concerns. That makes sense. I know we are at time, so I just want to say a big thank you to Brent and Richard for joining us today. What incredible work you're doing. Thank you for all you're doing for communities all over the place. Our next meeting will be on November 7th, and we hope that you all can join us. So yeah, add some love for Brent and Richard in the chat. Thank you again.
Yeah. Yeah, and we're obviously there's probably more questions than we can answer, but we're, as you can tell, both very geeked out on this issue and happy to dig in more. So reach out to us, and we're happy to help get into the details.
Yep, definitely. I second that. Yeah, and thanks again for the invitation. Really appreciate it.
Absolutely.
Work is
Thank you,
fantastic.
everyone.
Thank you for sharing.